This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Storyworks Roundtable. Kathryn and I are once again super excited to have the award-winning author Alina Sayre here to talk about fantasy as part of our genre series. We've already had Alina on. There is a companion episode talking a lot about middle grade fantasy, younger readership, and character development, character voice. So definitely go look for that. We will link to it in the show notes. Welcome back, Alina.
Thank you.
So, all right, this episode we are going to focus less on the readership and more on the fantasy genre specifically. So to start with, what are some of the reader expectations or genre expectations that go into fantasy, tropes, themes, character types, plot elements? It's kind of whatever you want to throw out.
Well, I think fantasy is often paired with another genre. In my case, it's middle grade fantasy. And I think that is a very specific set of expectations when the two are paired. You would look for different things going into an adult fantasy novel, for instance. I know middle grade fantasy readers, as I mentioned in the other episode, I'm a tutor, so I work with kids. Most of them love fantasy, and they're looking for excitement. They love magic, adventures, as much sword fighting as possible. And ultimately, I think a character they relate to and who goes on an adventure that grabs their imagination. They're willing to accept a lot of different twists and turns. They're not necessarily expecting the dragon on page 31, but as long as there's that feeling of adventure, I think they're good to go. I think I don't read as much in the other genres in fantasy, but I know like young adult fantasies, a lot of them have a trend of the frustrated love triangle. Personally, I do not enjoy this trend. A lot of the adult fantasies are really, I think, graded based on the quality of their world building. Brandon Sanderson is super popular right now, and I think people are really magnetized to his imaginative world building. Yes. A lot of adult fantasies, well, maybe fantasy in general, a stereotype is that writing quality doesn't matter as much as long as there's great world building. Personally, I'm turned off by, poor writing quality in any book, regardless of genre.
Me too.
So I think it really depends on the reader in that case. And I really enjoy a fantasy novel that includes good writing for any age.
Right.
Right.
Yeah,
So,
I agree. I agree with that. I think there is like a subset of fantasy that focuses more on just the set pieces and the crazy nonsense that you can throw on the page and not as much about the character arc or the journey.
Absolutely.
And that is definitely not something I enjoy reading or writing either.
Right.
It's hard when you don't have someone to attach yourself to, and all you're looking for is the next magical awesomeness or the next crazy scenery or world that you get thrown into. So
right, and yay for magical awesomeness, but to me it's not a substitute for an interestingly developed character and the ability to construct descendants. That's also important.
Right. Well, the character is truly the heart of any story. The character is what makes the story memorable because of the reader empathy, because we need, as Kathryn said, to attach ourselves to that protagonist that's the vehicle through the magic awesomeness for the reader, So at the end of a book, how many of those incidents or scenarios are you going to really remember if you haven't been compelled to live them vicariously with the character that you're empathizing with?
Right. That's completely my point of view on things. I know that's not for every reader, but that's definitely the perspective I take when I'm writing.
Yes.
That even someone who doesn't love fantasy as a genre, I hope could pick up my books and find something to relate with in the characters. I think that's kind of what gives it universality.
Interesting. So, okay. I mean, everything you listed for the middle grade fantasy, I would apply to any subgenre of fantasy, the excitement, the twists and turns, the, magic, the character you relate to, the world building. So other than romantic subplots, go ahead, Kathryn.
Another thing that you said that I really liked is that you pair it a lot with other genres. So like you said, middle grade and fantasy, and you can really pair fantasy, because fantasy, kind of like we were talking about with science fiction in a previous episode, is like it's the set that then you put the story into. So you can have, a fantasy mystery, a fantasy heist novel, a fantasy adventure story, a fantasy, you can throw any sort of story within the confines of a fantasy setting, because that's your world building. That's your gigantic, setting piece. And it has specific things that other people want to see, or that readers want to see in it, like the magic, like the sword play, if you're doing sword and sorcery kind of fantasy. And if you don't have that, the readers will be disappointed. But in terms of the structure of like what is happening within the story, you get a lot of freedom to be able to kind of go wherever you want to within that fantasy setting and that fantasy world.
Definitely. So let's talk about the fantasy world. What are some of the main set pieces for a fantasy novel?
I think that's as varied as the novel itself. I'm getting really interested as a reader in stories that kind of blend, as you were saying, Kathryn, fantasy with another genre. Right now, I'm totally in love with steampunk writing. That kind of takes
love that too.
Fantasy elements with alternate history, with a little bit of science fiction and a little bit of whatever the author can think of. I just read partway through the Invisible Library series by Genevieve Cogman, and I just love that anything can happen. She's totally constructing her own world. It's kind of alternate history, but kind of parallel universes and kind of steampunk, science fiction, fantasy. It's just off the wall, and I love it because I've read a lot of fantasy, and once you've read a lot of fantasy, you can kind of see what's coming next in a standard, pure fantasy plot. But when different genres get mixed together, anything can happen. And I think that's one of the appeals of fantasy or speculative fiction in general, is that you never know what's going to happen.
Right. So
as a reader, that's a big deal for me. I have to say, as a writer, I think world building is not my strongest suit. I think I'm more interested in building a character who's relatable and fascinating and real than I am in constructing the pillars of the castle in just such a way. I think there are writers who really, really specialize in that, and I really enjoy reading their work. I know Robert Jordan is really famous for building this world that you can get lost in, where you feel like you could buy a plane ticket and go there. But I think, as we talked about a little bit in our companion episode, that it's important to play to your strengths as a writer. Yes, work on things that are not as strong, and I definitely rely on beta readers and friends and proofreaders to give me feedback. What's not working? Where do you need more detail to make sense of this? But I think also knowing where your strengths are and building up that, that's why readers will keep coming back to you, is that there will always be someone out there who likes the thing that you can do, even if you can't do everything. So that's helpful to know.
Yeah, true. So you mentioned steampunk. So in that, we're going to have set pieces like automatons and, steam engines and probably some corsets and top hats and stuff.
Lots of fashion.
Yeah. Lots of fashion and sword plays. We're going to have swords and probably knights and dueling and things like that.
And wit. parlor conversation.
Yes.
Yeah. So what makes a fantasy fantasy? What would be universal to any of the subgenres? Is it just the fact that it's a world other than ours that isn't, technology driven? Like we were talking science fiction with Chris Fox and saying that the technology has to be integral to the plot for it to be science fiction. So with fantasy, would we say that's magic or just otherworldliness or what?
I think that when I try to explain the two genres to my young students, I kind of simplify it by saying, science fiction tends to look forward to an imaginary future. Fantasy tends to look backward to an imaginary past, or something that feels past-like, where there is, I think in both genres, there are unexplainable things, or things that don't exist in the real world. And that's probably the common denominator of speculative fiction. Stuff that hasn't really happened, or maybe that couldn't possibly happen in the world as we know it. I think fantasy tends to be unified by explaining that through the supernatural or magical means rather than technological or scientific means. Or if there's science, it's made up science.
Yeah.
Which is a lot of fun, I have to say. In my world, I decided to throw out the round globe concept altogether. And my world is shaped like an ice cream cone, so it's a flat surface, where the islands are spread out on the top on a flat world. The current of the world flows outward, eventually going down the sides of the cone. And so islands that break loose of their anchor can drift right off the edge of the world, which is a source of important conflict in the story.
Right.
But just an example of how fantasy gets to make up whatever.
Yeah,
Someone
very
who
cool.
didn't excel in science in high school, I have to say, it's very fun to make them.
Yes, I love your distinction between sci-fi and fantasy. That was just a really great definition. Now, so as someone who gets to make up the laws of her own universe, what kind of constraints do you feel as a writer? How much can you push that boundary with plausibility and verisimilitude for your readers, as opposed to just kind of going crazy with laws like gravity and the edges of the world,
So I do get a reality check from him.
Okay.
He's like, no. I think it's more important that the laws be consistent than that they be similar to our world. For example, the flat world's absolutely not what we live in, but as long as that law is consistent and everything keeps coming back to the same point, we transition. Especially if you're an experienced fantasy reader, your mind is ready to go to a place that has never been. You're ready to suspend disbelief as long as everything in the world behaves consistently.
Yeah.
That's very tricky when writing a series. I have to, before the fourth book that I'm working on right now, I had to go back and reread all of the books I'd written to remind myself, what details did I say? What, explicit things did I mention about the science of the world? Because I don't want to all of a sudden change a scientific law that I've put in place. Even though the ships fly, they have to fly based on explainable principles, even if the principles are made up. So it's kind of a different set of expectations than for a science fiction.
Yeah, although I will say that, so there, we talked about hard science fiction versus not more space opera style. There are fantasy readers who will do the same thing, who will figure out the laws that you have put into your world, and then they will call you on every single mistake that you make.
Right.
So you need to be careful that if you're setting up something that, magic systems especially, if you set up specific rules, do not ever break those rules. Your characters need to operate within the bounds of the world that you have set up. So that world building part, that's part of the extensive part about being a fantasy author, is you have to know down to certain details, not all the details, but down to certain details, how it's going to work so that you don't contradict yourself halfway through the book and go, oh, wait, hold on. I need my character to be able to use the magic in this way, but back in chapter 4, I said that you can't use it that way. So, don't, you have magic, but magic is not a get out of jail free card. You have to use it appropriately and consistently. Otherwise, you're going to get the same problem that other authors have with people calling them on their mistakes.
And I think that's where having a team of pre-readers really helps me. Some of them, each of them has a different strength. And so when I send them an early draft, they tell me everything that doesn't go according to the plans I previously said. They're seeing it with fresh eyes, whereas I've been going over it until I can't even see the details anymore. I think something else is that it helps to blend the fantastical with something real. For example, the kind of the central image in my books are flying ships. So obviously a fantasy concept. They fly based on a scientific magic system I've worked out. However, I have done a lot of research on real ships, the wooden sailing kind, because even though the ships are in the sky, it really lends credibility if they behave somewhat like a real ship. That has caused me a lot of trip-ups, because when I started writing the series, I knew nothing about ships. I ended up doing a field trip to take a sail on a ship to learn about what are these things called, and how much do they weigh, and what do you do when the wind picks up in the other direction. And it became very important to add that sense of realism and credibility to them.
Right. And it's something for your readers to grab onto.
Exactly.
Like, oh, a ship. I know what a ship is.
Definitely called me on that.
Yeah.
Yes. Oh, wow. It's so fun what we're willing to do for our stories, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah. Well, I just had to go sailing because...
Right. I get seasick, too. It's kind of unfortunate.
Oh, no.
Sacrifices for art.
Definitely. Definitely. I think we've all made a few of those. And it's also great for us that suspension of disbelief is on our side. And I think, yeah, no matter what genre you're writing in, you need to be so careful in a series, especially, and keep a manual or a Bible of everything you're putting into your story, because you need those details to be consistent throughout the whole, but especially in this kind of intensive world building.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Very easy to
Yes. You know, in like historical fiction, you have to go do your research and find these things, these facts that you can then imagine your characters doing in the world that are going to really bring a scene to life. So when you're inventing it, are you just drawing on real life all the time? Have you gone and said, oh, I'm going to invent this thing that doesn't really exist and we're going to use it this way and it's going to be so cool? Like, you know, how's that process? Is that...
I think a lot of it has to do with filling holes. For example, I have these flying ships. Why do they fly? I should figure that out. So I ended up developing a plant that gives off electricity. It has a supernatural origin, and the plant is the current provider for the ship to fly, and it powers the propellers that keep it in the air. So it's kind of an elaborate system that came from something made up because I needed a reason for it to do that. Sometimes it's just fun to build stuff.
Right.
I enjoyed developing the culture of each of the different islands where the characters visit. A lot of those are based on travels that I have actually taken or places I've been. So some of it is a matter of borrowing from life experience or blending a couple of different experiences together. But some of the things do need to just be made up from scratch, which is in a way very fun because there are no constraints. On the other hand, it's challenging to pull something from the air.
Yeah, definitely. Have either of you read something and, you know, gone, oh, no, sorry, this one can't suspend disbelief here. This one just won't work. Any gaffes that writers should be aware of?
I'm trying to think of, like, not so much being unwilling to suspend my disbelief as much as really seeing the world building on the page. I'm actually reading a book right now that shall go nameless. Okay. But that I have stopped to like about 20% of the way in because I am so tired of hearing the names of these things that don't, like, I don't have any way of like connecting them to real things or understanding what they are. And then they just keep saying them over and over and over and over and over. And it's gone to the point where like, I'm like, I don't need to hear that. Like nobody says the word human that many times. And that's what you're referring to, I think. And so I think a lot more often it's the world building that gets in the way than necessarily suspension of disbelief, but that the author gets so excited about what they've built that they want to shove it into every nook and cranny. And then you're like, whoa, as a reader, you just kind of go, oh, okay, stop. I don't care. what the name of this thing is. I want to know why it's important and why it's there and what's going to happen next with your character and that thing.
Communicating the world building is just as important. Yeah.
Right.
I think for me, it's less about the world building quality. I mean, if it's really terrible, that's another matter, but I can't think of a book I've read where the world building was so bad I couldn't deal with it. For me, it has more to do with the characters. I recently that also shall go nameless, where the characters were so immature and so adolescent that I just couldn't. When audible sounds of frustration and disgust start coming out of your mouth in public places, it's time to stop.
A good sign to put the book down then.
Right. Before anyone gets hurt.
Yes. Yeah. Kathryn, I think what you were saying was really important for everyone to make note of, and in other genres, especially historical, I call it showing your research, where the writer falls in love with this detail that you've discovered doing all of that research into your subject matter. And it's just so cool. You just got to find a way to work it into the story. But if it's not critical to that moment in the story, if it doesn't somehow advance your theme, your character, your plot, then it becomes extraneous. And then it stands out to the reader as, okay, this is here because the writer thought it was cool, not because I need to know this as a reader. And I think we, as you just pointed out, we can apply that to fantasy, to every genre. It might not be showing your research, it might be showing your invention,
Right. And I think there's no substitute for helping the reader understand so what. Like, this is important because here's how it impacts the character's life. Or this is important because look how much cooler it makes this scene in the story. Not just like, I made some stuff. You should be excited because I'm excited.
Yes.
It has to have a purpose. It's just like any other kind of sell where you have to convince someone that something you did or made is cool. There has to be a reason.
Right. And it has to be important to the characters, not not just to you, and certainly not just
I think another really big kind of fantasy thing that we haven't really touched on too much is ensemble character casts. Having a group of people is a really big deal in fantasy. Not all fantasy has it, but when you have usually you have multiple point of views and you have a big ensemble cast. So that's kind of like another thing that a lot of fantasy readers expect, which can sometimes be hard to pull off and keep it believable and not 7 million pages, although a lot of fantasy is long. So I guess there you go.
We know why.
I know, right? It's because you have 12 point of views, so you have to hit every... No, I'm just kidding.
Right, exactly. I have to say, that's absolutely true. I think with my series, the first book, The Illuminator's Gift, follows one point of view, and it's got, maybe 6 major characters as part of the main crew of the ship. As the story goes on, of course, they go different places, they meet different people, main characters start to cluster, until as I was partway through writing the third book, I realized I had 28 named characters. And I was like, no, can't do this. That's when in fantasy it's usually time to give some of the characters the axe, which is an entirely different process. But it's become important to add more points of view as the story has gotten bigger and more complex. In this fourth book, I'm currently running 4 points of view, and it's about as much as I can handle. But it need those to take us to all different parts of this epic conflict that's happening. And yet keeping them all straight and keeping them authentic to the character's voice. I think it's just not adding more complexity than you can handle.
Right, and not more than you need.
Right,
4 is still a very manageable number, but when writers get into, 5 or more, oh boy.
Perfect omniscience where every character has an opinion. It's like, wow, I've seen it done well a handful of times, but it's definitely something, it's like rock climbing or swimming. You don't take on more challenge or risk than your ready to handle.
Right. Well, and there are a lot of inherent pitfalls in multiple points of view. Your reader won't always know which character to attach to emotionally. Your characters can start to sound like echoes of each other instead of having distinct voices. It's very easy for writers to put the wrong point of view character in a scene, so they're showing some piece of action through the eyes of a character who doesn't have the most at stake in that scene. Right. So, my less is more when it comes to point of view. You definitely...
Yeah. And when you're talking about fantasy points of view like that, and especially as you get into the more epic fantasy genre, your reader expects you to have a full character arc, plot arc with every one of those point of view characters. They expect it all to wrap up at the end. Like, they don't just want that one main protagonist that you thought was the one main protagonist. No, they want all of his best friends and his best friend's mom, and everybody needs to have everything needs to wrap up all nice and tidy at the end, because everybody has to be a part of that final main epic battle. So you can easily get in over your head with fantasy and those characters.
The troops converge on the battlefield.
Right, exactly.
It's like,
and I think especially with middle grade fiction, readers are expecting a little bit less as far as character numbers. I think kids of 8 to 14 years old start to get overwhelmed if there are more than 4, 5, 6 characters going on.
Right, which makes sense. But, to what Kathryn was saying about the reader expecting that is as it should be. And as a writer, you need to go into this knowing you are going to deliver full character arcs for anyone who has a point of view. That is the entire point of giving a character that perspective. I call it the crown. POV is a crown. So if you're going to give someone a POV character, they need to earn that crown or off with their heads. And that means you've got to do the work of full development for every single point of view character. And readers should be able to know whose head they're in without the names being on the page. That's how distinct everybody needs to be from each other. So if you can't pull that off, cut your cast.
Exactly.
Or if you can't remember who's talking right now. It's probably too many characters.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. All right. Final thoughts on fantasy world building characters.
It's fun. If you haven't tried it, you should try it because it's fun.
Fantasy is a fun genre.
Without messing everything up. Make some science carefully.
That's right. Get on a flying ship and we're going to take a magical trip to the end of the world.
That's right.
And hopefully come back.
Right, and hopefully not fall off. Precisely. Well, Alina, thank you so much for joining us. This has been another really fun conversation, and you can certainly come back and join us anytime you like. Excellent. Thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.